This is saying that experiences, social experiences, is shaping and carving and sculpting an infant brain. And we have evidence, much evidence from animal studies and from some human studies that learning processes and memory are associated with changes in brain, not just brain function, but even brain structure. Both the development of dendrites, individual spines on neurons, the development of synapses, the connections between those dendrites, and even some evidence of development of new neurons is strongly influenced by use, and it's strongly influenced by disuse. And the pruning process, which erases or cleans up and organizes all these connections, is also strongly influenced by use and strongly influenced by disuse. This fits very well with the social orienting models of autism, which have been discussed repeatedly by colleagues like Peter M.I.N.D, Jerry Dawson, Ami Klin, and Kasia Havarska and the Yale group, in which small differences in social orienting can create differences in the social environment, so that autism, the child with autism loses more and more input as the child himself separates from the social world, doesn't attend to the social world. If these kinds of processes are true, then it's quite possible that normalizing and re-engaging in these kinds of more reciprocal and more interactive experiences can have profound effects on infant brains, including those of children with autism. And we have two fascinating studies from the dyslexia research that demonstrates, one by Keller and Just, published last year, and one by an Italian colleague, Spirinelli, that demonstrate that short-term behavioral intervention for dyslexia results in the change in the brain function, the patterns of brain function in reading areas and in phonetic areas. It results in the changes in the organization of the hemispheres, and it actually causes changes in white matter development, increased myelination. Myelination comes from short-term phonetic training for people with dyslexia in the 10 to 15-year age range. We're talking about rebuilding brains from behavioral experiences. And if this can happen in dyslexia at the age of 10 to 12 or so, certainly early experiences for young children with autism have much potential to change the biology that may be coming with the genetic and background or organismic effects of autism. In this way of thinking, early intervention is a biological intervention for autism. It's not just at the surface of behavior. It's going deeply into the development of the brain. And so what about early intervention? There are several findings that I wanted to highlight for you from the recent literature. One of them is, a study I was involved in, a study with Jerry Dawson, which was published earlier this year, and which demonstrates that a different approach than discrete trial teaching, a behavioral approach which focuses on relationship-based work, following children's leads, and emphasizing communication and play, can result in dramatic changes in child outcomes. This study involved children, mean age of 23 months, so this is one of the youngest studies that's gone on. It was a randomized controlled trial of 48 children. The children who were receiving the Early Start Denver model received 20 hours a week of intervention. The community as usual group received 18 hours a week of intervention. So this is not about difference in treatment intensity, but we were able to demonstrate significant changes in IQ, about a 20-point gain in the children in the Early Start Denver model group over 2 years, compared to a 6-point gain in the comparison group. Similar effects in expressive language, similar effects in receptive language, all significant differences over a 2-year period. Significant differences in adaptive behavior, which the parents reported. So this is reflected not just in the laboratory, but also in life experiences. And finally, significant differences in the change in diagnosis, where more children, significantly more children from the Early Start Denver model group had a milder diagnosis at the end of 2 years if they changed, whereas the community group more often moved to a more severe diagnosis. However, this was not reflected in ADOS scores. This is reflected in clinical expertise. And I think the challenge of budging the ADOS score is a theme that may come up several times in our talks today. I want to show you briefly videos from this. You're going to see Giacomo Vivanti. You're going to see a child here who's in the intake process at 22 months. This is a child from Sacramento. You'll see his intake ADOS, and then you're going to see an ADOS 1 year later. Would you start the first video, please? So the boy has no language. You see very neutral face. Not very oriented to the adult, though he's oriented to objects. It does not request. There's no gesture language here. He's going to start to flap in a minute. He does follow that gaze. There's a stereotypic behavior in his right hand. So we see a pretty passive little boy without a lot of developmental skills yet. Okay, you could stop that video, please. Okay, now you're going to see if this is 1 year later. This is halfway through the treatment. This is ADOS. This is during the conversation press. Would you start that? I'll say what he's saying in case the translators can't hear it.
Do you know that picture? Who's that?
Fish.
Yeah. Do you know his name? She knows his name.
She says, what is it? He says, fish.
Daddy fish.
She says, what's his name? He says, Daddy Fish.
I think Daddy Fish, sometimes people call Daddy Fish Nemo.
It's Nemo.
Or Mama fish on that.
He says, or Mama Fish on that.
He doesn't know where his mom is, I think.
The adult says, no.
In the ocean.
She says, we don't know where the mom is. The baby says, it's in the ocean.
I went swimming in the ocean one time.
The adult says, I was in the ocean.
Have you gone in the ocean?
She asks
I
him,
found
we're in the ocean.
the big ocean.
He says, I can't go in the big ocean.
When I get bigger, I can go in the ocean.
When I'm bigger, I can go in the ocean.
Yeah, big waves coming all over my head.
Okay, you can stop it. Okay, so he's still got kind of a neutral face, but he smiles, he's got good eye contact, his language is natural, his intonation is okay. It's not a scripted vocabulary, it's creative language. He's talking in phrases and short sentences. He's just turning 36 months at this age. So big changes can happen quickly with these very, very young children. Okay, the next finding I want to highlight in the early intervention work involves the kind of surprising findings from several randomized controlled trials involving the rather limited effects of parent-delivered interventions on children's developmental scores. And Jonathan is here and will talk about this study in more detail. But just in the last year, 3 different groups have reported on large randomized controlled trials involving from 60 to 150 children These are well-done trials of the Hannon method, of the social communicative method that's been used in Britain. The trials were done well. The interventions were carefully monitored. Parents demonstrate, 2 of the 3 studies, parents demonstrated increase in the skills that were being taught them. But these changes in parent behaviors were not reflected by changes in children's developmental scores or their adaptive behavior scores. Somehow I did not did this. There's also Carter studies here. This is a new paper coming out by Alice Carter, Paul Yoder, and a group in the States looking at Hannon, in which they found no main effects of the treatment, but they actually found an interaction with the child's developmental toy interests, whereas those children who had little interest in toys did show gains after this intervention. But those children who showed a lot of interest in toys actually did less well with language over time than did the comparison group, as if somehow this intervention approach was inhibiting the language intervention. So these are very important and sobering results. And I'm puzzled by them for several reasons. First of all, we know from other early intervention groups, from studies of children with Down syndrome, studies of children with cerebral palsy, studies of children of impoverished mothers, that parents can learn effective intervention approaches, and that children can show strong IQ and language gains in parent-mediated interventions. There are multiple studies and randomized controlled trials that demonstrate the effectiveness of parent-delivered interventions in other groups. We also know that young children with autism are quite responsive to increased learning opportunities and to increased teaching opportunities, and we know that this can be reflected in their changes in standardized scores. We see that in the early intervention literature. So it's complicated, I think, to understand why we're not seeing more effects in these well-done studies. One of the things that stands out to me is that in most of these studies, both groups improve. And as the general community becomes more and more knowledgeable about early intervention, it may well be that the treatment in usual groups are getting some good input for families, and that those children are also receiving the kind of enhanced environment that the children in these experimental treatments are receiving. So treatment as usual is not the same thing as no treatment, and that may be one of the complications here. Another problem involving methodology is that the tools that we're using were not developed to find subtle and small changes over shorter periods of time. We're using IQ tests, we're using the ADOS. They have a very different purpose, and we're probably needing to evolve measures that are more sensitive to small changes. Small changes over time may cascade into large effects. We may not be giving enough time for the effects to emerge. It may take longer for these effects delivered from the experimenter to the parent, to the child, and then reflected in standardized tasks. That may take more time than we're giving it. And finally, there are complex causal relationships here that we need to tease apart. And to really do that, we need large numbers